I'm gonna tell this the way it actually happened, not the way it sounds better to tell it. No clean arc, no moment where the music swells and I make the right choice and everything resolves. Real life, in the situation I'm describing, doesn't work like that. And anybody who's been in it knows that the clean version is an insult to how complicated and ugly and human the whole thing actually is. I grew up in Stockton, California. If you know anything about Stockton, you already have a picture in your head, and it's probably not wrong, but it's probably also incomplete. Stockton gets described in statistics: poverty rate, crime rate, the bankruptcy, the shootings per capita. And statistics are true and also completely useless for explaining what it feels like to be a kid inside them. What it feels like is normal. That's the thing nobody tells you. When you grow up inside a specific kind of hard, that hard is just the texture of the world. You don't know it's exceptional. You just know it's yours. My mother worked. I want to say that clearly. She worked constantly. Housekeeping at a hotel downtown, weekend shifts at a laundry facility, occasional babysitting for neighbors when she could get it. She was not absent. She was just stretched so thin across so many hours that by the time she was home, she was mostly a body that needed sleep. I don't blame her. I have not blamed her for a long time. But the apartment was empty a lot, and I was a kid who needed to be somewhere, and the somewhere I found was the street. My older cousin Jerome was the initial connection. Jerome was 20 at the time, which seemed ancient to me at 15. He ran with a set that operated in our neighborhood. I won't name the set or the larger affiliation because some of those people are still out there and I have a family now and I am not stupid. Jerome was not a recruiter exactly. He was just present. He was around and his people were around, and being around them felt like being inside something with walls. The recruiting, such as it was, wasn't dramatic. There was no formal conversation, no ritual I'd been promised by television. It was gradual immersion. You hang around long enough, you start being trusted with small things. You hold something for somebody. You pass a message. You're present when a conversation happens that you're not supposed to be present for, and nobody sends you away. And that's its own kind of invitation. And then one day you realize that you're not a person who sometimes hangs around these people. You are one of these people, and you don't remember exactly when that line got crossed. I was useful because I was young and I looked younger than I was. I had a face that adults found non-threatening. Cops didn't look at me twice. I could be in a location where an older member would draw attention, and nobody registered me as anything except a kid. This was, I understand now, the specific reason I was cultivated. I was not recruited because anyone particularly cared about me. I was recruited because my age and my face were assets. Knowing that now doesn't undo the fact that at 15, being seen as useful felt like being seen. The early months were intoxicating in a way that I think is only comprehensible if you understand what I was coming from. These were people who had money. Not enormous money, not the money of television drug lords, but cash money in an environment where my mother stress-counted change for the electric bill. They had clothes, they had phones, they had cars, and more than the material stuff, they had a kind of confidence, a way of taking up space in a room that I wanted so badly it was almost physical. I got a pair of shoes I had wanted for 2 years within the first month. I still remember exactly what they looked like. I wore them to school, and a girl I'd had a crush on since 7th grade noticed them. I am not proud of how much that mattered to me, but it did, and pretending otherwise would be lying. The first time I saw real violence was about 4 months in. I am not going to describe it in detail, partially because I don't think the detail is the point, and partially because, and this is still true 15 years later, there are specific images from that night that I do not revisit voluntarily. What I will say is that it involved 2 men I knew, a dispute over something I didn't fully understand at the time, and a level of brutality that my 15-year-old brain was not equipped to process. I went home that night and sat in the dark in my bedroom and waited to feel something definitive, some clear signal about what I was supposed to do with what I'd seen. Nothing definitive came. That's how it works. You think there will be a moment of clarity, a hard line you cross that tells you you've gone too far. Instead, there's just the next day, and the day after that, and the slow process of your nervous system learning to absorb things that should not be absorbable. I absorbed a lot over the next 14 months. I carried things I shouldn't have. I was present for transactions I shouldn't have been present for. I lied to my mother with a consistency and specificity that required real effort. Not just about where I was, but constructing entire parallel versions of my days that I maintained across conversations. I became good at that. That might be the thing I'm most ashamed of. Not the specific things I did, but the ease with which I learned to deceive the one person who would have been destroyed if she'd known. I also, and this is complicated and I've spent real time in therapy working through it, formed genuine relationships inside that world. Jerome was real family, complicated by everything we were both involved in, but real. There was a man I'll call D who was 12 years older than me and who treated me with a consistency and patience that I struggle to describe without it sounding like I'm making excuses for him, because he also did things that were terrible. Both of those things are true simultaneously. He was genuinely kind to me, and he was a dangerous man, and I loved him in the way you love a warped version of what you needed and couldn't find elsewhere. That's the part that doesn't fit in the clean version of this story, the part where the people who brought you into something destructive also gave you things that were real. The decision to leave, and I'm going to be straight with you, it wasn't one decision, it was about 40 decisions that accumulated over several months, started with a funeral. A kid from my high school, 17 years old. I won't say how I knew him or how he died, except to say that I knew both, and that standing at his funeral watching his mother, a woman I recognized from the neighborhood, a woman who reminded me of my own mother in the specific way she held herself, like she was physically trying not to come apart. Watching her at that funeral, something happened in me that I don't have a clinical word for, something realigned. I was 16 years and 9 months old. I was not going to be 17. That was not a dramatic premonition, it was a clear-eyed assessment of probability based on the information available to me. Leaving is not simple. I want to be direct about this because I think there's a version of this story that gets told where someone decides to leave and then leaves, and that's not how it works. You don't resign. There's no off-ramp that's clearly marked. What there is a slow reconfiguration of your behavior and your presence that is enormously risky if it's noticed, and enormously stressful to maintain while not being noticed. I started making myself less useful. Quietly, without announcement. I was less available. I had reasons. My mother needed me, I had a conflict, I'd been sick. I stopped initiating contact. I stopped showing up to things I hadn't been explicitly required to show up to. It was a withdrawal executed in slow motion over about 3 months, and it required a level of social intelligence that I'm honestly not sure I fully had. But I had Jerome. Jerome knew what I was doing before I told him. Jerome was not a man with a lot of illusions about the life. He'd been in it long enough to have lost several. He pulled me aside one night and said, without preamble, that he knew I was pulling back and that he wasn't going to stop me, and that he needed me to understand that his being unable to stop me did not mean that everyone shared that position. He told me to be careful in a way that meant something specific. The night I'm referring to in the title, the night they were watching my house, was a Wednesday in March. I had, the week before, declined to be involved in something that I had not previously declined things. The declination had been noted. I came home from school to find my mother's neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Patterson, who sat on her porch most afternoons, looking at me with an expression I had not seen her use before. She called me over and said, quietly, that 2 men had been parked across the street for most of the afternoon and had left about an hour before I got home. I went inside and sat on the kitchen floor. There's something about kitchen floors in moments of fear, I've noticed, and I called Jerome. Jerome told me to stay inside. He told me he would handle it, which was a phrase that could mean any number of things. He told me to call my mother and make sure she came straight home and stayed there. I called my mother and told her I wasn't feeling well. She came home. She didn't know why I'd really called her home, and I didn't tell her. We watched television together that night, a nature documentary about oceans, and she fell asleep on the couch before 9 o'clock. and I sat next to her and watched the windows. Nothing happened that night. Jerome, to this day, has not told me exactly what he did. I have not asked. Some questions are better as questions. What happened over the following months was a combination of Jerome's intervention and my own complete change of geography. My mother, for reasons entirely unrelated to what I was running from, a better job offer, a cousin who needed help in Sacramento, decided to move us that summer. I have never told her that her timing, which she attributed to practical circumstance, may have been one of the reasons I'm alive. I left Stockton at 17. I finished high school in Sacramento, I enrolled in community college, dropped out, re-enrolled, eventually graduated. I work in youth outreach now, specifically with teenage boys in high-risk environments, which is the most predictable possible version of my story, and I make no apologies for how predictable it is, because the work matters. I tell them a version of this story, not all of it, some of it they don't need and some of it isn't mine to give anymore, but enough of it. Enough so they understand that I'm not standing in front of them as someone who never stood where they're standing. Jerome is still in Stockton. He's been in and out of the system. We talk occasionally, not often, but occasionally. The conversations are careful in the way conversations are when two people share a history that only partially maps onto who they currently are. I love him. I don't know how to fully explain that to people who find it complicated. D is dead, has been for several years. I found out through a mutual contact, and I felt grief that I was not prepared to feel, that I had not given myself permission to feel, and I processed it mostly alone because there was no clean way to explain to the people in my current life why I was mourning a man whose obituary they would have found disturbing. I have a daughter. She's 4. She has a specific way of laughing that is so purely joyous it is almost unbearable to be near. I am the father that my circumstances did not produce for me, which is the most important project of my life and the one I think about constantly. She will never know what the shoes looked like. She will never understand what it felt like to be 15 and empty and to have someone look at you like you occupied space that mattered. I hope she never needs to understand it. I hope I am enough of a reason that she never does.